If you're here because you aren't currently feeling too great, then all my love and my warmest vibes to you. And I hope that something we share today helps you in some way. And if you're here because you want to feel even better or because you want to be ready to face future adversity, then that's really great because that proactivity is going to go a long way in helping you to live your best life and also protecting you from these future trials that we will all inevitably face. So now I want to stress that the information that we will be sharing with you today is not something that I came up with myself. It's based on international research by the world's leading psychologists, including Yale's Dr. Laurie Santos, Dr. Paul Bloom, and from several books on the subject of alleviating depression and enhancing well-being by the foremost experts in the field, like Dr. Martin Seligman, who's known as the father of positive psychology, Dr. Stephen Ilardi, the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, Sean Aker, whose TED Talks on happiness you may have seen, and many others. So why are we talking about happiness and why now? So to be honest, we should be talking about mental health and well-being every day because there are a lot of unhappy people around us. So the World Health Organization identified over 800,000 reported cases of depression in Sri Lanka. And there are many causes, including poverty, postpartum depression, chronic stress, and anxiety. So low income is one that is strongly associated with depression among men in Sri Lanka. And 10 to 15% of our mothers are reported to experience postpartum depression, usually in the first 3 months after childbirth. And about 9% of our undergraduates screen positive for major depression. Also, our director of mental health has stated that 10% of the population is affected by mental health problems, which is a huge number, and about 1/3 of mental health disorders in the country are specific to depression. And you can see that, as in other parts of the world, the prevalence of depression in Sri Lanka is higher among females. But when it comes to suicide, it's actually the opposite. Significantly more men in Sri Lanka die by suicide than women. And our suicide rate is very high. Nearly 3,000 people die by suicide every year, with many more attempting suicide. So in fact, Sri Lanka is 29th in global rankings for suicides, which puts us worse off than people who live in Ethiopia, Syria, or Iraq. So if you've been feeling blue, if you've been feeling down or depressed, there's one thing that I want you to know, and that is that it is not your fault. And I'm going to go into the reasons that I say that. So let's start with the words of the philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti, who said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society." Let me repeat that. It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. And unfortunately, it is a sick society that we live in. So to quote the psychologist Jay Watts, who wrote in The Guardian, poverty, relative inequality, being subject to racism, sexism, displacement, and a competitive culture all increase the likelihood of mental suffering. And if you add into the mix individual experiences like childhood sexual abuse, early separation, emotional neglect, chronic invalidation, and bullying, you get a clearer picture of why some people suffer more than others. There are many situational and social factors in this world that can cause suffering. But we don't need to experience any extremes in order to suffer. How many of us feel totally frazzled just trying to lead a normal life? How many of us feel like this, right? Me trying to excel in my career, maintain a social life, drink enough water, exercise, text everyone back, stay sane, survive, and be happy, right? I mean, if you can relate, just put a yes in the chat. So sometimes that's exactly what it feels like, right? And the reason for this is that the lives that we are leading today, all of us are completely different from the lives that we are biologically wired to live. You can see some yeses coming in. So in prehistoric times, as hunter-gatherers, the lives that we lead, that we had led as individuals in prehistoric times, we led completely different lives. And yet those are the lives that we are physiologically meant to live, the lives that our brains are wired for. We are meant not to be isolated, sedentary creatures in concrete jungles. Instead, we are meant to operate in groups and tribes because we are social animals. But instead, today we are too often isolated. We live in an increasingly individualistic culture where we're told that it's everyone for themselves, where instead of meeting our friends for fun, we put on Netflix and we scroll through Instagram, right? And we're also meant to move, but instead we sit all the time. We don't move about daily to hunt, to gather food as our ancestors did. So today, the way that we put food on the table is by sitting in one place and typing away at keyboard. And in prehistoric times, we lived in nature alongside the animals, and we are basically animals. So research is showing that exposure to the natural world has a huge impact on our sense of well-being and other animals as well. So for example, apes in the wild, in nature, they would never sink to the same level of depression as apes in captivity, even if they are subject to abuse from other monkeys. Also, we are not meant to feel this level of daily stress. So many of you would have heard of the fight or flight response. So that is triggered by the part of our brain called the amygdala when we experience stress. And the purpose of this stress response is to prepare our body either to fight an enemy or to flee a predator. Now, this was very useful to our prehistoric ancestors, but in today's world, our stressors are not life-threatening. They're not tigers lurking in the bushes, right? They are our work assignments, our bosses, our family, the news. And as a result, we can end up in a constant state of chronic stress. And then finally, we aren't meant to seek money and things. And yet, very often, we sacrifice what truly makes us happy in order to make more money. But research actually shows that wealth has a very limited bearing on our happiness. I mean, obviously, if you don't have a roof over your head or food on your table or clothes on your back, then of course, money matters a lot. But once you have those things, it doesn't add value to your life to keep craving more. So, in fact, what the science tells us is that materialistic people, that is, people who think that happiness comes from accumulating stuff and from a superior status, they actually have much higher levels of depression and anxiety because they're not as good at savoring the positive. So research shows that due to a process called hedonic adaptation, no matter how much money and stuff we get, we very quickly return to a baseline, stable level of happiness. For example, I remember the first time that I got my first salary when I was 18, 10,000 rupees. So can you imagine being delighted about a salary of 10,000 rupees? But I was over the moon. It was the most money I had ever had for myself. But over the years, I got increment after increment, and each time I was happy for a few weeks. But then I adapted to each new number, and it had no effect on my happiness. So even I would say that that first salary of 10,000 is probably the one that I was the happiest about. So that is hedonic adaptation in action. Now, another factor that I want to talk about is that when we are unhappy and depressed, it could well be because we have very real problems that need real solutions. So let me tell you a story to illustrate this. Once, a famous psychiatrist visited Cambodia to introduce antidepressant medication to the Cambodian people. So he tried to explain to the local doctors what these pills were for, and he ran into a problem because the doctors didn't understand this concept of antidepressants. So he tried to explain. He said, if you're feeling unhappy, then we give you these antidepressants and then you feel much better. And then they said, okay, we get it now, but we don't need your antidepressants because we already have them. So the psychiatrist was confused, and the doctors took him out to a dairy farm And they pointed at a cow and they said, here is an antidepressant. So then the psychiatrist said, I really don't understand. And the doctors explained. So they told him that there was a farmer in their community who had lost his leg to a landmine. And he was given a false leg, but then he was depressed because it was still very painful for him to work in the fields and was traumatic because of the memories of what had happened to him there. So then the community came together and they bought him a cow. And the doctors explained, so now he is a dairy farmer and his depression, which was once very deep, has now lifted. So you see, they told the psychiatrist, we already have antidepressants and we don't need yours. So what this true story points out is not that there isn't a place for medicine, but if possible, our first option shouldn't be to mask our symptoms, but to resolve the core problem altogether. And that if we have a community support to solve our problems, we have a much greater hope of doing so. We looked at a number of reasons why we might be unhappy, but sometimes it can also be that we are stuck in a pattern of negative thoughts, that our minds have become a prison of worries and doubt and self-criticism. And this practice of going over negative thoughts endlessly is called rumination. So first, let's understand why it happens. So let's take a very simple example. Have you ever worn something new, let's say maybe to work, and you had like 5 people complimenting you, but there was one person who made a negative remark? So what was it that stuck in your mind for the rest of the week? Was it the 5 compliments that you got or the one sarcastic remark, right? So obviously it's the negative remark. And the reason for this is something called the negativity bias. And it is the tendency of our brains to register negative stimuli more readily than positive stimuli, and also to dwell on negative events. So the reason that this tendency exists is because in our hunter-gatherer days, something stressful in the environment could be a matter of life or death. So it made sense to be hyper-conscious of it. So for example, if I ate a poison berry last week and I nearly died, I need to remember that very well, and I need to be sure to avoid those berries like the plague. Because among our ancestors, those who didn't pay special attention to negative events never lived to pass on their genes. But this negativity bias doesn't serve us well in today's world, where our lives aren't in constant danger, but our brains still haven't caught up. So, to put it in the words of Dr. Rick Hanson, who in his book Hardwiring Happiness, he describes it very creatively. He says our brains are like Velcro for bad experiences and like Teflon for good ones. So the bad actually sticks to our minds and the good bounces off of us. So now we know that there are many legitimate reasons why someone might feel unhappy, anxious, or even depressed, including these, problems stemming from society or traumatic experiences. And when I say traumatic experiences, I don't only mean abuse and poverty. I also mean, even heartbreak, loss of a loved one, major exam stress, and so on. Also, we're living in a world that is completely contrary to the one that we're biologically wired for. We have real situational problems that need real solutions. And of course, our brains aren't designed to help us out either, right? Thanks for nothing, brain. So, is there a reason to hope? Well, the answer is yes, there is. Because although we have so many difficulties to contend with and negativity bias is a reality, so is neuroplasticity. And this is the brain's ability to constantly rewire itself throughout our lifetime. So we can actively train our minds to refocus on the positive. And in doing so, we can escape rumination and worry and build our resilience and joy.